She stood at the doorstep after 3 silent years, rain-soaked and trembling, clutching a small child to her chest. Her father froze when he opened the door. His once confident eyes widened in disbelief, as if the past he had tried to bury had suddenly come alive again. This was the daughter he had cast out, pregnant, desperate, and alone. And now she stood before him, holding a little girl whose curls framed a face that carried pieces of his own. His breath caught, and for a moment the world around them seemed to stop. She whispered through tears, "Dad, this is Lily." But the look on his face was more than shock. It was the heavy weight of regret pressing against years of silence. What she was about to say next would not only tear open old wounds, it would shake the very foundations of everyone who thought they knew their family's story. Before we unravel this shocking story, tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Because what happened next left an entire town questioning what it truly means to forgive, to love, and to face the consequences of choices that can never be undone. Ephana was just 19, a young woman with dreams that stretched far beyond the narrow roads of the small rural town she called home. In a place where everyone knew everyone, life was governed by reputation, whispers, and the fear of shame. Her father, a man deeply rooted in tradition and pride, believed his family's name was worth more than their individual happiness. To him, dignity was measured not by kindness, but by how spotless one appeared in the eyes of neighbors. Ephana's mother, gentle and compassionate, often tried to soften the harsh rules that defined their household, but her voice was drowned in silence. She loved her daughter dearly, but her words carried little weight against the iron will of a husband who valued authority over empathy. It was within this fragile home, one filled with tension and quiet obedience, that Ephana's story began to unfold in ways no one could have foreseen. In the evenings, Ephana would walk barefoot across the wooden porch, listening to the creak beneath her steps, dreaming of a future where she could choose her own path. She longed for freedom from the stares of villagers who measured worth by conformity, and then, like many young hearts yearning for belonging, she found solace in love. The boy was kind, gentle with his words, and made her laugh in ways that eased the heaviness at home. But in towns where reputation was currency, a secret like theirs was too fragile to last. When Ephana discovered she was carrying a child, her world spun into a storm she was unprepared to face. For a moment she clutched her stomach and whispered, "I will love you no matter what." That private vow of devotion was made in innocence, not yet knowing how costly love could be when measured against a father's pride and the judgment of an entire town. When her father found out, the house became a battlefield. His voice thundered against the thin walls, echoing across the neighborhood, until even the chickens outside went silent. His anger was not only about the pregnancy, it was about shame, humiliation, the fear of gossip spreading through every corner of their community. "You have disgraced me!" he shouted, his fist slamming against the table. Ephana stood trembling, tears streaming down her face, her mother clutching her apron, powerless to stop the storm. The mother's soft plea, "She's still our daughter," was met with a sharp glare that silenced her instantly. For Ephana's father, forgiveness was weakness, and weakness was unacceptable. The young girl's heart broke not just from his words, but from the realization that the man meant to protect her had chosen reputation over love. That night, the small home became unbearable. Every corner heavy with judgment and sorrow, every shadow a reminder of her father's rejection. The breaking point came swiftly. One cold morning, with the sky still pale and gray, Ephana's father commanded her to leave. His words cut through the silence. "Pack your things. You will not stay under my roof." The mother wept quietly in the corner, whispering prayers into her hands, torn between loyalty to her husband and the instinct to shield her child. Ephana stood frozen, clutching a small bag and fighting back sobs that burned her throat. The father's face was stone, unforgiving, rigid, unmoved by her trembling voice when she whispered, "Please, I have nowhere to go." He turned away, as if she had already ceased to exist. And so, with her mother's muffled cries behind her and the weight of a father's rejection on her shoulders, Ephana stepped out into the cold dawn, pregnant, alone, and with no place to call home. From that day forward, her name was spoken only in hushed tones, if at all. In a town where everyone's business traveled faster than the wind, Ephana became a ghost in her own community. Her father carried on as though she had never existed, greeting neighbors with the same proud posture, convincing himself that erasing her presence had restored his dignity. He believed that his decision had cleansed the family of shame, that by turning his daughter into an outcast, he had preserved their name. But in truth, every night when the house grew quiet, the silence he had forced upon himself grew heavier. Still, he never admitted it. In his mind, Ephana was gone forever. He thought he had erased her from his life forever, but he had no idea what was coming. Ephana's footsteps echoed on the empty streets that first night after her father cast her out. She wandered with a small bundle of clothes pressed against her chest, her body heavy with the child she carried, her spirit already bruised by rejection. The town that once felt familiar now became a place of cold stares and whispered judgments. Neighbors who had once smiled as she passed now turned their faces away, as if acknowledging her would stain their own reputations. She tried to find shelter with the girls she once called friends, but doors that had once been open now closed quickly, excuses spilling out faster than compassion. "I can't," one said, not meeting her eyes. "My parents wouldn't allow it." Ephana swallowed her tears and forced herself to keep walking, the sound of laughter from inside their homes cutting her deeper than the chill that gnawed at her skin. As the days turned into weeks, the weight of pregnancy pressed heavier on her small frame. Nights were the hardest. She slept beneath trees at the edge of town, the damp grass clinging to her dress, her body trembling against the cold earth. Hunger twisted her stomach, but it was the loneliness that hurt the most. She whispered to the unborn child, "You're all I have, but I'll protect you." Those words gave her strength to endure when exhaustion threatened to break her. Yet every passing day reminded her of how completely alone she had become, abandoned by friends, ignored by neighbors, and erased by her own father. In that isolation, the world felt unbearably wide, and Ephana wondered if she and her child would ever truly belong anywhere again. Then, when she had nearly lost hope, an older woman appeared. Quietly, unexpectedly, as though she had stepped out of the very shadows Ephana had learned to fear. The woman introduced herself only as Miriam. She had soft eyes but carried an air of mystery, her presence both comforting and unsettling. Miriam offered Ephana shelter in a modest home at the edge of town. "You don't need to be alone," she said, her voice calm, steady, persuasive. Too exhausted to question, Ephana accepted. That night she slept on a real bed for the first time in weeks, tears of gratitude soaking her pillow. Yet in the back of her mind, a question lingered. Why would a stranger help her, when everyone else had turned away? Miriam's kindness was steady, warm meals, gentle reassurances, and the quiet patience of someone who understood suffering. But her motives remained hidden. She asked little about Ephana's family and never shared much about her own past. Sometimes Ephana would catch her staring with an unreadable expression, as though she knew more than she let on. It was unsettling, but also strangely comforting. For the first time since her exile, Ephana wasn't alone, and yet, in the quiet hours, as she lay in bed listening to the creak of Miriam's footsteps across the wooden floorboards, she couldn't shake the thought, why did this stranger appear exactly when Ephana had nowhere else to turn? The months that followed were a blur of aching nights and weary days. Miriam's small house became both a refuge and a prison of unspoken truths. Ephana's belly grew heavy, her body worn down by exhaustion, yet she carried herself with a quiet determination that surprised even her. When the time came, It was a stormy night. Rain pounded against the thin roof, the wind rattled the shutters, and Ephana clutched Miriam's hand as waves of pain coursed through her body. She had no doctors, no midwives, only the guidance of the older woman who whispered words of comfort in the dimly lit room. After hours of agony, a cry finally pierced the night, a fragile, trembling sound that filled the air with hope. Ephana looked down at her child, tears streaking her face, and whispered, "You're here, my little one." In that moment, the weight of rejection seemed to vanish, replaced by fierce, unconditional love. But even in that joy, shadows lingered. Miriam noticed how Ephana avoided speaking about the father of the child, how her eyes drifted away whenever the subject surfaced. Neighbors speculated, as they always did, but Ephana gave no answers. To every question, she responded with silence, or with words so vague they only deepened the mystery. "It doesn't matter," she would say softly, cradling her child close. "What matters is that she's safe." But why hide such a crucial truth? Why carry the weight of secrecy in a life already so burdened by struggle? Miriam, though kind, could not ignore the unease building in her own heart. She suspected that whatever name Ephana refused to speak carried the power to unravel more than just a young woman's pride. It could tear apart everything she held dear. As weeks passed, Ephana grew more protective, shielding her child from both the gossip of the town and the curiosity of Miriam. Every coo, every breath, every sleepless night was guarded fiercely, as though she knew that to reveal even the smallest detail about the child's father would invite danger. The older woman watched closely, but she did not press. Still, the silence became its own confession, and the question hung over them like a cloud. Who was he? Why was Ephana willing to endure shame, banishment, and loneliness rather than speak his name? That secret, unspoken yet heavy, lingered in every glance, every pause, every moment Ephana clutched her baby, as though the world would tear her apart if the truth ever came to light. By the time the baby's cries had settled into the rhythms of early life, Ephana's silence had become more alarming than her words. People in town continued to whisper, their theories spreading like fire in dry grass. Some believed the father was a boy from the neighboring village, others suspected a married man, while a few claimed it was someone far closer to home. Each rumor threatened to chip away at the fragile peace Ephana had built in exile. Yet no one knew the truth, not even Miriam. And Ephana seemed determined to carry that secret alone, no matter the cost. She pressed her child close, eyes burning with the weight of things unspoken, because the truth about the child's father was the one thing that could destroy her family forever. For months, whispers swirled like smoke through the narrow streets of the village. Neighbors speculated, tongues sharpened with gossip, but no one could pierce the silence Ephana held onto so tightly. Then, slowly, a truth emerged that stunned everyone. The father of her baby was not the reckless boy they imagined, nor some distant stranger whose name would fade with time. No, it was someone deeply rooted in their own world, a man respected, a man who dined at the same tables as her father and shared in the very traditions he claimed to protect. The revelation spread like wildfire. Ephana's child was tied by blood not to a nameless mistake, but to someone who carried influence and honor. And when that truth reached her father's ears, the silence in their home turned colder than the winter winds. Everything Ephana had been hiding was about to come crashing down. The fallout was swift and merciless. Villagers who had once pitied her now looked at her with sharpened judgment. To them, her shame was greater than they had imagined, not only because of her pregnancy, but because of the name attached to it. Ephana's father, consumed by humiliation, withdrew further into his pride, convincing himself she had destroyed his reputation intentionally. Ephana bore the brunt of it all, but instead of collapsing under the weight, she grew more determined. Each tear that fell hardened her resolve. Each cruel whisper only reminded her of the life she was building for her child. She clutched her baby close, whispering, "They may curse my name, but they will not curse yours." And in that vow, Ephana began to find strength where others expected only despair. But beneath the surface of scandal and shame, another layer of truth quietly unfolded. Miriam, the older woman who had taken Ephana in, became more than just a shelter in her storm. She was a steady presence at the child's side, guiding, protecting, and shaping the little one's earliest years. Yet Ephana noticed things, how Miriam watched the child with an intensity that was difficult to explain, how she often lingered when Ephana slept, humming lullabies as though they were her own. It raised questions that Ephana could not yet voice, because as shocking as the truth about the child's father was, it was nothing compared to what was hidden in plain sight. The real twist wasn't about the man she loved. It was about the person who raised her child. 3 years passed before Ephana returned to the place that had once cast her into the cold. She did not come as the trembling girl who left, but as a woman who had endured storms and learned to stand in the rain. Her child, now 3 years old, clung to her hand, eyes wide with innocence, curls bouncing with every step. The moment she set foot on the village road, gossip erupted like wildfire. Old neighbors whispered from doorways, their voices filled with both curiosity and judgment. "She's back," one muttered, "and with a child." Some looked on with pity, others with disdain. Yet Ephana's face carried neither shame nor fear. It carried a quiet strength, the kind born only from suffering transformed into resilience. She walked toward her father's house, every step a defiance against the years of silence and exile that had once threatened to erase her. Inside the old home, her father sat stiffly at the table, refusing to lift his eyes when the door creaked open. His pride, the same pride that once banished her, kept his gaze locked on the floorboards. Ephana's mother rushed forward, her voice breaking as she whispered, "Ephana, my child." But the father remained unmoved, his jaw tight, his hands gripping the chair as though loosening them would make him weak. The child's small voice cut through the silence. "Mama, who is he?" The question made the room tremble. Ephana bent to her daughter and whispered, "This is your grandfather." For the first time, the man shifted, though his eyes stayed fixed on the ground. He thought his silence could shield him, but what came next tore apart the walls he had built around his pride. For when the truth surfaced, it wasn't what the village had imagined. It was far closer, far heavier. The child's father was not a nameless stranger, nor a boy from afar. He was a man from within their own circle, someone the father knew, someone whose respect he had once craved. And in that revelation lay an unbearable mirror. Years ago, before he held himself as a man of unshakable honor, he too had carried a secret, a daughter conceived under circumstances just as shameful, just as hidden. He had built his life on condemning in his child what he had once done himself. Now the hypocrisy stood before him in the shape of a 3-year-old child with innocent eyes, carrying his very bloodline forward. The room fell into a silence thicker than stone. The mother wept quietly, her hands trembling against her apron. Ephana's daughter clung to her leg, unknowing of the storm she had just uncovered. The father, once a figure of power and authority, sat frozen in his chair, stripped of words, stripped of certainty, stripped of the pride he had clung to like armor. All the judgments he had cast, all the shame he had forced upon his daughter, now circled back to reveal his own hidden past. And in that moment, the man who once cast her out fell silent. The silence stretched unbearably, each second heavy with the weight of unspoken years. The father's chest rose and fell, his hands trembling though he tried to keep them steady. Pride had been his shield for so long, but now it cracked beneath the sound of a child's laughter. The little girl tilted her head, studying the stern man before her, then tugged gently at Ephana's dress. "Mama," she whispered, her voice carrying through the room, "is he really my grandfather?" The word struck like a lightning bolt. Grandfather. It was the word he never thought he'd hear, and it broke him. His eyes, once hard as stone, glistened as tears he had buried for decades threatened to fall. The villagers who gathered outside pressed closer, peering through windows, whispering about the man who had once condemned his own daughter. For the first time, his pride began to tremble beneath the truth of his bloodline. Ephana's mother stepped forward, tears streaking her face, her hands clasped in desperate plea. "Please," she cried, "forgive her, forgive yourself. This is your family." Her voice cracked with years of suppressed sorrow, finally breaking free into the open air. Ephana stood still, her child at her side, her face no longer pleading, but resolute. She had endured his rejection, his cruelty, and the weight of gossip, yet she stood strong, not as the girl he had cast away, but as a mother who had survived. The child, with innocence untouched by history, stretched out her small hand toward him. "Grandfather," she said softly, the word pure, untainted, heavy with love he didn't think he deserved. The villagers held their breath, waiting to see if the man defined by pride would finally choose love over reputation. And in that moment, he broke. Not in weakness, but in the painful birth of humility he had resisted his entire life. The moment seemed endless, as though time itself was waiting for his choice. The father's hands shook as he looked at the little girl, her small fingers reaching toward him with trust he did not deserve. For years he had clung to pride as if it were his only salvation, but in that instant he saw what it had cost him. The laughter of a daughter he had cast away, the joy of a child who might have never known his name, the peace of a home that had been broken by his own stubbornness. Slowly, painfully, he rose from his chair. His voice cracked as he whispered, "Come here." Ephana hesitated, her heart pounding, until the little girl toddled forward and wrapped her arms around his knees. The walls of his pride finally collapsed. He fell to his knees, pulling his daughter and grandchild close, tears streaming as the villagers watched in stunned silence. For the first time, he understood what he had nearly lost. His embrace was clumsy, broken, but real. Ephana's mother wept openly, her prayers answered in the only way she had ever hoped for. Ephana, though scarred by years of exile, let her head rest against her father's shoulder. The pain of rejection could never fully vanish, but in that embrace was the seed of healing, and as they held each other beneath the gaze of the village that once condemned them, the lesson became clear. Blood may bind us, but pride can destroy us. Forgiveness is never weakness. It's the only way families survive. What would you have done if you were in Ephana's shoes? Would you forgive a father who abandoned you? Let us know in the comments. If this story touched you, hit the like button. It helps us bring more powerful stories to light. And subscribe for more real tales that stay with you long after the screen goes dark.